Most people work their entire lives and never understand why wealth always stayed just out of reach. Because on the surface they did everything right. They worked hard, earned decent money, avoided obvious disasters, and still ended up living paycheck to paycheck. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody explains clearly. There is a specific financial threshold that changes how money behaves, and most people never cross it. And that number is not 50 to zeros or 75 to 100. It's the first 100 zeros, and because around 6 figures the math of compounding quietly flips from working against you to finally working for you. And below that line investing feels pointless, slow, and almost insulting, while above it money starts showing up in ways you can actually feel. And the reason this matters so much is not motivation or mindset, but arithmetic. Compound growth is mathematically insignificant at small balances. So if you start from zero, compound interest does not care about your goals, your effort, or your dreams. It only responds to scale, which is why someone can save diligently for years and feel like nothing is happening. So let's strip away the hype and look at simple math. Invest at $10 at a long-term average 7% return, and after a year you've earned about $700, which is roughly $58 a month. Not enough to change your life. Not enough to quit a job. Not even enough to reliably cover a car payment. So let me ask you honestly, have you ever looked at small gains like that and wondered, what's the point? Now take that same 7% return on $100,000 and suddenly you're earning $7 a year, about $583 a month, and that's rent, groceries, utilities, or a meaningful portion of real expenses without working extra hours. And this is the exact inflection point where investing stops feeling like blind faith and starts becoming observable reality, because below 6 figures investing feels like hope, and above it investing starts behaving like a system. And that psychological shift matters just as much as the math, because when you see money cover bills without your labor, your behavior changes, your patience increases, and your stress drops, which is why the first 100 zeros in is brutally hard and why so few people ever reach it, not because they can't, but because the early years demand discipline with almost no visible reward. The average American saves roughly 2-3% of income, and at that rate it can take decades to reach 100,000 if inflation doesn't move the goalposts first. So what separates those who break through from those who don't isn't intelligence or luck. It's understanding human psychology and building systems that work around it, because 3 cognitive biases destroy more wealth than market crashes ever will. First, incentive cost bias, where immediate pleasure always feels more real than future security. Second, social proof, where your brain copies the spending habits of friends, coworkers, and neighbors even when those habits guarantee financial stress. And third, deprivation bias, where giving up a restaurant meal today feels more painful than the abstract idea of being wealthy later. And these aren't moral failures. They're hardwired survival instincts that worked in a hunter-gatherer world, but fail miserably in a modern economy. So the people who build wealth aren't superhuman. They simply recognize these biases and design their finances to neutralize them, while everyone else stays trapped without realizing what's pulling the strings. A powerful way to cut through this is inversion. Rather than asking, how do I build wealth? Ask, what guarantees I stay broke? Because the answers are obvious. Spending every raise, financing depreciating assets like cars, believing you deserve luxuries before you can afford them, taking financial advice from people with no savings, carrying credit card balances at 18-24% interest, and chasing hot investments you don't understand. And if you pause for a second and look at your own behavior, which of these patterns do you recognize in your life right now? This is where the real work begins, because reaching the first 100 Zoldert is not about clever investing, it's about accepting what the math actually demands. So here's a realistic example. If you earn 60 zeros in a year and manage to save $10,000 annually while earning a 7% return, you'll reach 100 Zoldert in about 8 years. And most people won't do this not because it's impossible, but because they won't accept the lifestyle trade offset requires. And here's the part nobody tells you. In those early years, roughly 85-90% of your progress comes from savings, not investment returns, which means your income, savings rate, and discipline matter far more than picking stocks. And this is why get-rich-quick schemes are so seductive and so destructive. because they promise to skip the accumulation phase, which simply cannot be skipped. The early years look boring and uncomfortable in real life. Smaller apartments, older paid-off cars, skip vacations, and watching your account grow at a pace that feels embarrassingly slow. And this is exactly where most people quit, because they confuse slow progress with no progress. But discipline, not motivation, is what carries you through this phase. And once you finally cross $100 and the math begins to work with you instead of against you, because now that same 7% return generates $7 a year, and with continued contributions the next 100 often takes 5 years instead of 8, then momentum builds, and by year 15 you're approaching 300. By year 20 you're pushing past 500 zeros, and not because of genius, but because compound growth finally has enough mass. And here's the psychological shift that comes with it. You stop feeling fragile, you stop panicking about every bill, and options start to appear, which is why wealthy people obsess less over picking investments and more over avoiding mistakes, staying within their circle of competence, and doing boring things consistently, because for most people that means low-cost index funds in a 401k, Roth IRA, or taxable brokerage, broad diversification, and ignoring the noise, not day trading, not chasing crypto tips, not timing the market, because one emotional mistake can wipe out years of disciplined saving. Whether it's an unaffordable car, consumer debt for a wedding, or a can't-miss business idea from a friend, and every one of these decisions feels justified in the moment, even though they all share the same DNA. Emotional reasoning disguised as logic. So understand this clearly: the $30 car at age 30 doesn't just cost 30 zeros, and it costs roughly $225 in lost compounded growth over 30 years at 7%, meaning you didn't buy transportation, you sold future freedom. And this is why successful wealth builders tie lifestyle upgrades to net worth milestones instead of income, delaying rewards until after progress is locked in, which feels backwards in a culture built on instant gratification. The uncomfortable reality is that building the first 100 usually takes 5 to 10 years, not months, and the alternative to patience isn't freedom, it's decades of paycheck dependence. So you're not choosing between sacrifice and comfort. You're choosing between short-term comfort and long-term security, because time will pass either way, and 10 years from now you'll either have assets or regrets. And here's where most people get distracted. They obsess over returns instead of savings rate, spending hours trying to squeeze an extra 1% from investments, while ignoring that increasing annual savings from $5 to 15 zeros matters 20 times more. So let me ask you this: are you focusing on the exciting variable or the effective one? Because early on, savings rate drives everything, which is why lifestyle inflation is so dangerous, especially for high earners, since a raise that should accelerate wealth instead funds a nicer apartment, car, and restaurants, leaving net worth unchanged, and income without savings is just consumption with better branding. Add high interest credit card debt and wealth building becomes mathematically impossible, because compounding now works against you, turning every dollar of interest into future wealth you'll never see, which is why the order matters. Eliminate high interest debt, then invest, not both at once. Your peer group also plays a massive role, because spending habits are contagious, and if everyone around you normalizes leasing cars and expensive vacations, frugality feels like deprivation, even though normal in America often means broke, anxious, and underprepared for retirement with Social Security and Medicare alone, so breaking away often feels lonely at first. But that isolation is temporary and the financial stability is permanent. Strip everything down and the formula is boring but effective. Save 20-30% of income if possible. Invest consistently in diversified low-cost funds. Avoid consumer debt. Resist lifestyle inflation. Stay patient and let time do the heavy lifting. Because the real choice isn't whether you'll build wealth. It's whether you'll feel rich for a few years or actually be financially secure for decades. And the first 100 is hard, not because it's optional, but because it's the gate you must walk through for money to finally start working for you. So choose accordingly. And if this reframed how you think about saving and investing, subscribe for more clear, practical breakdowns of U.S. personal finance. Comment the word DESCAIPLINE below so I know you watched to the end. And watch the next video where we break down exactly how to structure a 401k and Roth IRA for long-term growth while managing taxes and risk. This content is for educational purposes only, not financial advice. Investing involves risk, and taxes and results vary based on individual circumstances. People reach the end of their lives without ever truly understanding why wealth always remained just out of reach. And the tragedy is that it was never about laziness, intelligence, or bad luck, because millions of people worked hard, earned respectable incomes, stayed employed for decades, and still retired anxious, dependent, and financially fragile. And the reason is brutally simple and rarely explained clearly. Because wealth follows mathematics, not effort, and there is a specific financial threshold where those mathematics finally begin to cooperate instead of resist. And that threshold is the first $100,000, not $50,000, not $75,000, not some vague milestone, but a concrete number where compound growth transitions from being mathematically insignificant to materially meaningful. And below this level, the system feels rigged, investing feels pointless, and progress feels insulting, while above it, money finally begins to move on its own with enough force to be felt in real life. Which is why so many people give up before they ever reach it, because starting from zero is psychologically brutal, and compound interest at small balances is not inspiring, it is discouraging, and the math explains exactly why. When capital is small, growth is small, regardless of how good the rate looks on paper. And this is where people misunderstand compounding and blame themselves instead of the arithmetic. $10,000 invested at a long-term average of 7% produces roughly $700 in a year, which breaks down to about $58 per month, an amount that changes nothing in a real budget, does not reduce working hours, does not lower stress, and does not create freedom. And because the result feels meaningless, people assume the strategy is broken and quit. That discouragement is not a character flaw, it is a predictable response to slow feedback, because human brains evolved to respond to immediate results, not delayed exponential curves. Now compare that to $100,000 invested at the same 7%, which produces $7,000 per year, or roughly $583 per month. And suddenly the outcome feels real, because that amount can cover groceries, utilities, part of rent, or a car payment. And at that moment, investing stops being theoretical and starts becoming observable. And this is the inflection point, where money begins to work alongside effort instead of merely reflecting it. The difference between these two scenarios is not motivation or optimism. It is scale, and scale is what turns compounding from background noise into momentum. Below six figures, investing feels like belief without evidence, and above it, investing feels like a system that finally responds. This is why the first $100,000 is widely considered the hardest, because nearly all of it comes from discipline rather than returns. In the early years, roughly 85 to 90% of progress toward that first milestone comes from raw savings, not from market gains, which means income management, expense control, and consistency matter far more than stock selection or market timing. And this reality makes wealth building feel boring, restrictive, and unfair compared to the glamorous narratives sold by financial media. The average American saves only a small fraction of income, often 2 to 3%, which mathematically guarantees decades of stagnation, especially once inflation erodes purchasing power. And this is not because people are incapable of saving more, but because human psychology is wired against delayed gratification, social friction, and invisible progress. Incentive-driven behavior pushes spending today over security tomorrow. Social proof causes people to copy the consumption patterns of peers regardless of consequences. And deprivation bias makes small sacrifices feel disproportionately painful compared to abstract future benefits. These forces operate automatically, silently steering decisions, and people who remain broke are usually not aware they are being controlled by them. While people who build wealth recognize these tendencies and design systems to neutralize them. The wealthy do not rely on willpower, they rely on structure, automation, and rules that remove emotion from decisions. One of the most effective mental frameworks used by disciplined wealth builders is inversion, the practice of identifying what guarantees failure and then systematically avoiding it. Financial failure is guaranteed by spending raises as quickly as they arrive, financing depreciating assets, normalizing consumer debt, chasing investments without understanding them, trusting advice from people without results, and prioritizing appearance over security. These behaviors feel normal because they are common, but common is not successful. Normal in modern society means high income with low net worth, anxiety around money, dependence on paychecks, and retirement funded primarily by Social Security rather than assets. The path to the first $100,000 is therefore not mysterious, but it is demanding. Consider a realistic example within a United States context. An individual earning $60,000 per year who saves $10,000 annually and invests at a 7% return will reach $100,000 in approximately 8 years. This timeline is not exciting, and that is precisely why most people reject it emotionally, even though the math is sound. The early years provide little reinforcement, and progress feels slow because it is slow, but slow does not mean ineffective. The accumulation phase front-loads discomfort and back-loads reward, and this reversal of gratification is why discipline outperforms motivation. Motivation fluctuates with results, while discipline operates independently of feedback. People who reach the first $100,000 are not more enthusiastic, they are more consistent. They continue saving during years, when the account barely seems to move, and that persistence is what allows the math to eventually flip in their favor. Once the threshold is crossed, compound growth begins to assist instead of resist. 7% on $100,000 produces $7,000 per year, and when continued contributions are added, the next $100,000 often takes significantly less time than the first. This acceleration is not optimism or storytelling, it is arithmetic. The curve steepens as the base grows, and over time the contribution of market growth surpasses the contribution of savings. By the 15th year of consistent investing, balances can approach $300,000, and by the 20th year, $500,000 becomes realistic, assuming steady behavior and long-term market participation. At this stage, money begins to generate income comparable to wages, which creates a psychological shift as powerful as the mathematical one. Financial anxiety diminishes, flexibility increases, and decisions are no longer dictated entirely by short-term cash flow. This is why experienced wealth builders emphasize avoiding mistakes more than seeking brilliance. They understand that large losses reset progress, while average returns compounded consistently produce extraordinary outcomes over time. Staying within a circle of competence becomes critical. For most individuals, this means using tax-advantaged accounts like a 401 or Roth IRA, maintaining broad diversification through low-cost index funds, managing taxes thoughtfully, and ignoring speculative distractions, attempting to outperform markets through stock picking, crypto speculation, or options trading without expertise introduces unnecessary risk and often results in catastrophic setbacks. One emotional decision can erase years of disciplined saving, whether it comes in the form of an unaffordable vehicle, a debt-funded lifestyle event, or a high-risk investment framed as an opportunity. Each of these decisions feels justified in isolation, yet collectively they explain why so many people hover permanently below the threshold that changes everything. The true cost of consumption is rarely understood because opportunity cost is invisible. A $30,000 car purchased at age 30 does not merely cost $30,000, it costs the compounded value of that money over decades, which at a modest 7% return approaches $250,000. That trade is rarely framed honestly. It is not transportation versus inconvenience. It is present comfort versus future independence. Successful wealth builders internalize this trade-off and delay major lifestyle upgrades until after specific net worth milestones are achieved. Rewards follow progress, not the other way around. This discipline feels socially uncomfortable, especially in environments where peers equate spending with success, but the discomfort is temporary while the benefits are permanent. Time is the only non-negotiable ingredient in wealth building, and it cannot be rushed or replaced. The choice is never between sacrifice and happiness. It is between short-term gratification and long-term stability. 10 years will pass regardless of behavior. And at the end of that decade, there will either be assets compounding quietly or regrets compounding loudly. Many people misunderstand this because they focus obsessively on investment returns instead of savings rate. In the first decade, increasing savings from $5,000 per year to $15,000 per year has a far greater impact than increasing returns from 7% to 10%. Chasing performance while ignoring behavior is a distraction that feels productive but yields little progress. This is why lifestyle inflation is so destructive, particularly for higher earners. Raises that should accelerate wealth building often vanish into larger apartments, newer cars, and more expensive habits, leaving net worth unchanged despite higher income. Income alone does not create wealth. Savings rate determines wealth. A moderate earner with discipline often surpasses a high earner with consumption-driven habits. Consumer debt compounds in the wrong direction and actively destroys wealth. Credit card interest rates in the high teens or 20s make progress mathematically impossible because the same compounding that could be working for investments is working aggressively against the borrower. Eliminating high interest debt is therefore a prerequisite to investing, not a parallel activity. Attempting to build wealth while carrying consumer debt is equivalent to filling a leaking container. The order matters, and ignoring it guarantees frustration. Social environment reinforces these outcomes. Spending patterns are contagious, and proximity to high consumption behavior normalizes it, even when it leads to stress and fragility. Many people appearing successful are one disruption away from crisis, funded by debt rather than assets. Wealth builders eventually stop seeking validation from people who do not share their goals. This often creates a period of isolation during the accumulation phase, but that isolation fades as financial stability grows. The formula that separates those who cross the first $100,000 from those who do not is simple and unglamorous. Save a meaningful percentage of income, ideally 20% or more when possible. Invest consistently in diversified low-cost funds through appropriate accounts. Avoid consumer debt. Resist lifestyle inflation. Increase earnings without increasing spending. Remain patient for 5 to 10 years. These actions are not exciting. They are effective. They require saying no frequently and intentionally. No to unnecessary upgrades. No to impulsive spending. No to speculation. Each no preserves future optionality. Automation supports this process. Savings and investments are scheduled on payday before money can be spent. Expenses are tracked to eliminate waste. Subscriptions are audited. Income growth is pursued through career advancement, skill development, or strategic job changes. While lifestyle remains stable, market noise is ignored. Consistency is prioritized over cleverness. This approach is boring, and boredom is its strength. The ability to tolerate boredom while others chase excitement is one of the most underrated wealth-building skills. The real decision is not about money. It is about time orientation. Spending to appear successful produces immediate validation and long-term dependence. Delayed gratification produces temporary discomfort and long-term freedom. The difference between a $1,000 monthly lifestyle and a $2,000 monthly lifestyle is not merely $1,000. It is over $1 million in lost compounded growth over a working lifetime. Small recurring decisions quietly shape massive outcomes. The first $100,000 is difficult by design because it requires rejecting cultural defaults and trusting mathematics over emotion. Below it, a person is working for money. Above it, money begins to work alongside the person. This threshold does not guarantee wealth, but it creates momentum, optionality, and resilience that cannot exist without scale. The path is not secret, but it is narrow, and it demands patience, consistency, and humility. This content is for educational purposes only, not financial advice. Investing involves risk, and tax outcomes vary by individual circumstances. Those who understand and respect these principles play